So the first question is from Amy Burt, who asks, how does assessing adequacy relate to data saturation?
Okay, do you want to take that one?
Yes, we had an extra slide on that.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, so this is an issue that's raised quite a lot. I suppose, just to start out with, I think we find the concept of saturation rather problematic in that it's actually quite, well, it's hard to assess when you've actually reached saturation. I think the practical operationalization of saturation has been shown to be quite problematic. So I think we've, in a way, moved away from the issue of saturation because of that, because of the practical problems of actually applying it. Also, it depends what type of definition of saturation you're talking about. If you're thinking of a grounded theory saturation, then the requirements to have reached saturation are an awful lot higher than the way the term is used among other social scientists. But basically, the short answer is we don't relate to the concept of saturation, and we've actually discussed that in one of the upcoming papers, not in the PLOS paper, I don't think. Yeah, so that's the brief answer. But if you're interested in that particular topic, we could probably share with you the section that we've written in the upcoming paper on that specific topic.
Great.
Yes, the next question is from Fran Toy, and Fran, you might have to clarify this if it's a question and how we should answer it. There are two different concepts in coherence. What do you mean by that, Fran? Could you clarify, please?
Fran, should we give you the mic? Perhaps that would help.
Actually, he did provide a second continuation of this question, so you can scroll down the box.
Okay, yeah, you're right. Okay, so the first concept is that a transformation conceptually, and then the second concept is consistency across studies, and these two are very different concepts. So can we comment on how we apply this within CERQual? The idea of transforming the findings. So if I understand the question correctly, it's related to the triangle that we showed on one of the slides. So for coherence, essentially what we're assessing when we assess coherence is the review finding a good representation of the data? And that might seem like a given, that of course it should be a good representation of the data. But one can assume that there are many situations where you have a review finding and it may not represent all of the nuances in the data, or some of the data points actually show the opposite of what you're talking about, but it was just one small piece of data. So there are a number of situations where the data doesn't perfectly match the review finding. We have found that this component especially forces the review team to go back and sometimes reevaluate whether the review finding was written correctly, whether they maybe overstepped in terms of interpreting the data. They took it too far so that it actually doesn't represent the data. So it's kind of a double check for the review team to make sure that the review finding is an adequate representation of the data. And then secondly, in the cases where there are ambiguous data, so in the pictures that Claire showed earlier, there's some pictures where we're not sure if the woman is crying or laughing. And that could be in data all the time, that you're not sure what it is actually saying. So you would rate down for coherence in that case if you are uncertain, if it seems like it may be supporting the review finding, but it's a bit unclear. You might also rate down for coherence if, like I said, there are disconfirming cases that you have chosen not to take into account in the review finding. So a rule of thumb for coherence, though, is that you would either rate down for coherence, or you would be more case by case in your review finding. You would be more descriptive of all of the different studies or data points that contribute to that review finding. I would ask if that's clear, but it's hard to get feedback. So I'll just, if someone doesn't quite understand that, please ask another question to follow up.
Great. We'll take another question. Heather, what's the next one?
So the next one is from Andreas Zurishis. Do some of the criteria hold more weight than others? Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Okay, thanks. No, we sort of view the 4 components as having equal weight within the system. Having said that, perhaps I should also add that we don't sort of try and give a numerical weight to the CERQual components. What we suggest is that review authors make a judgment about their level of concern for each component and then look across those to make an overall assessment. But in essence, we give equal weight to the 4 different components. Claire, do you want to add?
No, I think that's...
Okay, let's take another question.
The next question is from Amy Burt, and she asks, or says that coherence seems difficult, especially when there's a variety of values or beliefs could be expected among the population of interest, and how can we consider this?
I'm not quite sure I understand. I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Should we give Amy the mic?
Yeah, if that's all right.
Amy, would you like to just tell us what just talk about your question?
Oh, here she says, I think you're answering the above question now. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay.
I do want to just say one thing there, because I think we can't be clear enough when it comes especially to coherence. Coherence is not the gold standard. It's not what we're trying to achieve. It's okay to have lower coherence for a review finding. In some cases where you try to achieve high coherence, you can get very banal findings that don't actually say anything and are very superficial in a way. So it's not like we're always trying to achieve coherence, and that's important to remember when you're doing your review findings. It's sometimes okay to have lower coherence in order to come to a more interpretive finding.
Just so to add to that, and the question earlier about the consistency element versus, the consistency element. So in a situation, I mean, the easiest situation of all is when you're in a situation where all of the studies are showing exactly the same thing. It's very easy to summarize. It's very easy to reach a finding which is coherent. The challenge arises when your findings show quite a bit of variation. And there you have the choice between creating a summary which potentially flattens out that nuance but offers a finding which is perhaps more useful for the decision maker, but potentially at the expense of coherence, or where you create a finding which is really quite intricate and complicated and reflects all of these nuances but potentially might be less helpful or useful for the end user. And that's the sort of trade-off. So yeah, that's the relationship we're talking to when we're talking about consistency of findings and the assessment of coherence, if that helps.
I wonder if we should show those slides, the extra slides, Claire, just to talk a bit to that point. Just give me a minute to flash down to them.
The questions. Oh, sorry, there's one more question. Miretu, we will come to your question in just one moment. Simon is just finding a slide that tries to illustrate what we were just discussing.
Okay, so this is an example of this type of situation. So on the left-hand side, you'll see option 1. We've given a finding which tries to describe all of the nuances of the data that we found for this particular review finding. So we've said, so this was a review about how children experience long-term versus short shifts in child institutions, such as orphanages. So most children preferred staff to have week-long shifts because they liked the stability and structure and the opportunity to form attachment. Children in one study preferred short shifts, but these children had poor relationships with their caregivers. In one study, the experience of the children were unclear. So there we've been sort of true to the data. It's a sort of more or less a match. You know, this is what the individual studies said. So we don't have any concerns about coherence. However, you may say, okay, well, that's kind of a complex message to give to the end user. For instance, somebody planning services, child institution services. Another option would be to transform the data to a greater extent and say something like, in situations where children have good relationships with their caregivers, they prefer longer shifts because these provide stability and structure and opportunities to form attachment. So the authors there have pushed this further, and they've interpreted the data, and they've said there seems to be a connection between the relationship children have with the staff and the extent to which they prefer longer shifts. So we haven't referred to the study where the experiences were unclear, and we've transformed the data from the other studies. So you might think, so one argument would be, okay, option 2 is more transformative, it's more helpful, it's shorter, it's clearer, it may be more useful for the decision maker. However, we've taken chances, we've gone further in the interpretation, that might be it. So in that situation, you might want to sort of raise a little flag and say, okay, here's the finding, but be aware we do have some concerns about coherence. Yeah, so again, it's this example of a trade-off between extreme detail and not very transformative, but no concerns about coherence, and a more transformative finding, but more concerns about coherence as well, potentially. Okay, I think that's...
Great. So please, if you have further questions on coherence, which is one of the conceptually difficult components, I think please just pop them in the chat box. So we'll take the next question, which was about scoping reviews, and the person asked, can we apply CERQual to evaluate scoping reviews? It used to be the case that such reviews are not required to evaluate the quality of individual studies as well as synthesized evidence. However, there are recent recommendations that it should be done in scoping reviews. I don't think any of us are experts on scoping reviews. I think if you have a situation where you've created findings through a process of qualitative evidence synthesis, you can use CERQual to assess how much confidence you have in those, regardless of the sort of what you call that kind of review. But of course, CERQual is not a tool for assessing the quality of the or methodological limitations of the individual studies. You'd need to use a different tool for that. I mentioned the CASC tool earlier, only because that's one of the more commonly used, but there are more than 100 such tools that you could choose from. I hope that answers your question. Were there any others? Oh.
Okay. We have another question from Andreas. Could you also give an example on adequacy? What would you suggest as a definition for richness? Okay.
Well, again, it's always tied to the findings. So what you perceive to be rich enough in relation to that finding. And again, I think just to sort of create, if you have a continuum between, I mean, you can imagine that some of the findings that you come up with in a qualitative evidence synthesis are really quite simple. They're describing a phenomenon which doesn't really require a lot of richness. So, for instance, off the top of my head, something about nurses experiencing a lack of equipment as a problem in delivering a specific service you could argue that that's a relatively simple finding. The same review might come up with a very complex finding about how nurses experience a certain element of or certain treatment, or providing a certain treatment, which would require much richer data and much thicker descriptions for you to be convinced that that finding is justified. So it's always on a case-by-case basis, and there isn't such a thing as a sort of, you've reached sort of richness nirvana, if you like. It's always in relation to the finding. And this is perhaps one of the elements that's easier to understand when doing it. The only warning I would have is that, of course, if you're in a review, if your review comes up with 10 included studies, then you may find that you may adjust your expectations so that a finding that only had 2 studies would be considered thin, but a finding that had 10 studies feeding into it would be considered rich. Whereas you may, if you have a review that included 50 studies, you may suddenly consider 10 studies to be quite a small number. So you have to be aware of that potential trap. Don't think about this in relation to how many studies you have. Think about that in relation to what would it take to convince you in regard to that particular finding. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a general point there, which is, I think all of this comes back to the fact that we assessing confidence in relation to individual review findings. And in the same way that in grade for effectiveness we'd be looking at the data in relation to an individual outcome. And I think there's therefore going to be a lot of variation across the review in how these different factors play out. So, for example, if you look at the issue of methodological limitations, typically in a review we would assess that up front when we're doing the data extraction. We would assess risk of bias and methodological limitations, and we would do that in a qualitative evidence synthesis too. But once you have the individual findings and you're doing your CERQual assessment, you need to look at that assessment of methodological limitations in relation to a particular finding, because it may be that some methodological concerns are more important for one finding than another. So for example, if your part of your review is looking at issues that may be highly sensitive, for example issues around sexual behavior, and you have a lot of included studies where the data is drawn from focus groups, you may be very concerned for those findings about the extent to which people are likely to talk openly about their beliefs around sexual behavior in a group setting. Whereas in findings that are not dealing with that issue, that group setting may be fine. So those assessments that you're making really do have to be at the level of each finding. It's going to vary. Do we have any other questions, Heather?
Not for the participants at the moment.
Okay. Well, please feel free to send in your questions. We have another 10 minutes or so, and we could take a few more.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, to me, what is obvious is that this CERQual is clearly related and perhaps even rooted in grade assessment of the effectiveness evidence, and it's by definition then also rooted in a particular epistemology or ontology, as one would say. And I know that in qualitative research community, this is usually a issue that's discussed, and so is that something that you are positioning yourselves explicitly? Because I guess that in healthcare research in general, that's my impression, even in qualitative research, we are more kind of leaning towards this post-positivist paradigm, and some other social scientists might be less inclined to accept that as a fundamental position. So I'm just asking if you can comment on that.
Maybe I can make a couple of quick comments, but I'm sure the others would want to add. Of course, there are some qualitative researchers who don't think we should be doing qualitative evidence syntheses at all, for a whole range of reasons, both sort of practical and epistemological. And I'm sort of not going to go into those arguments, because I think a starting point for CERQual has to be that we assume it's reasonable to do a qualitative evidence synthesis. In relation to your second point, interestingly, we've done some experiments, if you like, because we've tried to engage with a wide range of communities in developing the tool, including people who would perhaps consider themselves to be more sort of or less applied social scientists, in other words, using qualitative methods in a less applied world. And what we found is if you ask those groups about how they would assess confidence in findings from a qualitative evidence synthesis and have some discussion about it, they more or less invent CERQual. So people are doing these things intuitively. I think when reading a qualitative evidence synthesis, we're thinking about, well, how well were those underlying studies conducted? You know, to what extent is their data to support what they're saying? You know, how consistent or coherent is the data that's contributing to that finding? So people are thinking about these issues, and that's what we found. People come up with them. So I don't think it's incompatible with the way that people generally view these things, but what we try to do is to sort of systematize that. Of course, in doing that, there's always the danger that people will apply it in a sort of unthinking way, and obviously that's something we would prefer people not to do. And I think as one becomes more experienced with the tool, and of course it's helpful if you have a reasonable level of qualitative research experience in the first place, I think it becomes easier to apply it in a more thoughtful way. I think it's also the responsibility of the GRADE-CERQual Project Group to develop training materials and guidance, and that's something that we're trying to do at the moment, and hopefully will help people to apply this in a thoughtful way. Okay, Heather, do you want to add?
Yeah, I could add that, I mean, obviously, you know, large groups of, or core members of the GRADE-CERQual development team, including the three of us, have backgrounds in both qualitative and quantitative research, but perhaps what's been more important is that we very much work in an applied world. So I think, as Simon said, our starting point is that we are trying to develop evidence to support decision makers, and that has been the starting point rather than a sort of positivist versus a more sort of relativist epistemology. And so again, as Simon says, our starting point is definitely that it's possible to do a qualitative evidence synthesis, and that we want to do this specifically in the context of supporting decision makers. And of course, if you say A, you necessarily have to say B. If you're going to support decision makers, you are going to have to give them some indication of whether they should have confidence in that research or not. I would like to think that, I mean, obviously we've tried to pull in, as Simon said, we've tried to pull in groups from either side to both learn from GRADE, but also to ensure that this is grounded in qualitative research. I'd like to think that we've fed back, it goes both ways, the influence goes both ways. For instance, when we give webinars and workshops to, for instance, social anthropologists who don't work in an applied field, we also use a different language to present GRADE-CERQual, and we find that it's relatively easy to manage that. For this particular webinar with a Cochrane audience, we've obviously made the connection to GRADE for effectiveness consistently, because this is the audience we're talking to. Actually, what we have found when we teach people who come from a quantitative background is that they have an assumption that GRADE-CERQual is very much based on judgment, whereas GRADE is much more rigid and easier to use because much less judgment is required. And that's something we've been trying to feed back to them again, that this idea of judgment and transparency is equally important for both systems. So we do try to sort of, if you like, remind people in the quantitative world that GRADE is also, judgment is also a very central part of GRADE for effectiveness. So Simon's just put up a slide here, which is just one of the examples of how we've used GRADE-CERQual in real-life decision-making processes. So the background for the development of GRADE-CERQual was our involvement in WHO guidelines, where we were working on guidelines of complex interventions, particularly this one on task shifting for abortion services, but also other WHO guidelines, where the WHO asked for information about acceptability and feasibility to complement the evidence on effectiveness. And that's when we started introducing qualitative evidence syntheses to WHO guideline processes. And that's when we realized that we needed to give them some indication of our confidence in the findings. So this comes very much, the development of GRADE-CERQual comes very much from more than a sort of post-positive tradition. I think it comes very much from an applied research tradition. I think that's where we belong. I don't know if that...
Yep, thanks.
Maybe I could just add one point in relation to our experience of applying or the circle being used in these decision-making contexts is that, for example, when guideline panels of the WHO are presented with evidence on the effectiveness of interventions and evidence from qualitative evidence syntheses on the acceptability and feasibility of the intervention or how people value different outcomes with their respective assessments of confidence, we found that people deal with that quite well. They see how those assessments are sort of pointing at a similar idea but using a different approach, and we've had quite positive feedback about that. So we haven't found that to be a problem in the decision-making contexts that we've worked in.